Welcome to Middle Fingers Up. It's good to gup Shup. This is the Angry Brown Girl Club series. I'm your host, Karen McKay. This is segment 5 of 5. Okay, so where do we pick up today? First of all, thank you to everyone who has watched or listened to segments 1, 2, 3, and 4. Appreciate you've stuck it through. Over the past few episodes, we have been unpacking deep-seated ways racism and privilege show up in our lives, in our language, and in our relationships. I started this series because I was feeling helpless. I just got to a point where I was feeling helpless watching people I care about, people I thought that were in it, like in this with me, fall back into whiteness the moment their privilege and power were challenged. This helplessness has continued and gotten in the way of me sharing my experiences with racism, the internal racism, the link between the two. And I think the scary part is my helplessness meant I was giving up on these people that I care so much about, because most of them, it felt at the time, were giving up on me when conversations about my racial experiences and how that's linked to the world kept being denied with things like, let it go, it's not that way, love is love, why is it always about race? And then I think the big one, really the biggest response, is the one when you're just met with silence. So, no more excuses, no more silence from people who claim to be beside us, but also then rush to protect the whiteness the second it gets uncomfortable for them. I walk away from these conversations feeling like I'm the bad guy, like I ruined the night, like I just should have let it go, let it slide. But then, why and how is it possible that at the same time a white friend can say to their brown friend, I'm so sick of your white people talk, while calling another woman of color their bestie? Like how does that work? These relationships don't exist in isolation. There's many of them out there, and they are a racial contradiction. A white mother, how can she sit at a brunch and laugh and tell the cutest story about her little white daughter, sharing how relieved she was after watching a historical movie about Black women and how relieved she is that she's a white girl? No one blinks. No one blinks when these things come up. No one says anything or even thinks how we are failing these little white girls, these little white kids, and this village around them, these caregivers, these people that are raising them. They are perpetuating these little girls and becoming best friends with other little girls of color, and then the cycle just continues. So here's where it shows up. You guys know I have worked my whole career in mental health, and I have sat at tables where Child and Family Services is in the process of figuring out whether, what service to provide a family in crisis. I have watched the conversations when they are with white families versus families of color, and how quick apprehension in taking these kids out of these immigrant families of color, these people of color, their homes, but there's been no thinking about how that's more traumatic, the dynamics of this culture, what the community support can look like, all those things. Where in history is this borrowed from? We talked a lot in this series about patterns and how they are repeating themselves, how we repeat them. If we can't see how that connects to what's happening in North America, all around the world, if we can't see how it's all linked to the way immigrants, people of color, are treated in emergency rooms when seeking mental health supports, sitting in a therapist's chair, how dark-skinned kids are being disciplined more harshly in classroom settings, then we're missing the point. White majority thinking and big privilege energy. Okay. That thing where people act like whiteness is a baseline, like the standard, the norm. It's the same mentality behind the Asian driver stereotype. Bear with me. Okay, in a world that is built around whiteness, anything that doesn't fit white norms is automatically labeled strange, untrustworthy. Growing up in my community, races were often pitted against each other, so fostering this racism from one race to another. One particular example I think a lot of us can relate to, and it's so specific, but that's like what's so, I think, important for us to recognize. It's like how deeply it's all embedded. So one particular example of how every race fell into the white norm trap was a stereotype of Asian drivers being bad drivers. This stereotype is a clear manifestation of white majority thinking. White people don't have to name their whiteness in conversation. It's assumed. It's unmarked. It's the default. And notice how quickly race is brought up when talking about one of us. This stereotype is not based on reality, but on skewed perceptions. So how is it that kind of a stereotype persists? It's because in a society, whiteness is the norm, as we've been saying. Any deviation from that white norm is seen as inferior or problematic. So this whole stat is skewed because it doesn't account for the fact that bad drivers exist in general. But in order to keep the white status above and the rest of us below, we have to mark those sort of problematic behaviors with the race, the color. So the stereotype of an Asian driver being a bad driver is a faux fact. It's a myth perpetuated by society that views anything non-white as other. And this is what we have to look at more. We have to talk about these examples, the patterns in language, how we quickly buy into something and think, yeah, because of your color, that's how that is. The way white people will say they support people of color, work alongside us, care for us, but the moment they're in conflict with another person of color, listen to how quickly that tone shifts. That white person who gets it suddenly starts with the native guy, the Muslim lady, the brown chick. They'll usually use race to justify keeping whiteness at the baseline. This happens all the time. And we, as people of color, sometimes hand out passes to certain white people because we grew up with them, our bros. They sat at our dining room table and listened to the sad story of our moms being treated poorly by the post office worker. They have had beers with our dads. These friends we are so loyal to because they got us, and it always felt like they were there when we needed them. And if you realize, if you pay attention, if you watch for it, those same people will turn around and create distance when it serves them. And if you really pay close attention, you'll realize you do it too. Don't look for it in others. Start with yourself. You are the proof. So here's where I'd like to admit my anger. What makes me so angry is when my heart sinks, my tummy feels swirly. I know that my gut, my intuition is telling me to do something. But I feel like I can't because once again, These are those loyal friends, the people that we feel have stuck by us, the people that we have the fun, good times with. If I lose one more white friend, I won't have any more friends. So all these pressures, all these things we do to keep this relationship looking like it's great and we're allies and we support each other. But it's so fragile because if I really go there and call out that microaggression or inquire about why race had to be brought up in this whole story in the first place, I will be met with so much resistance and I won't be the loyal friend. I will not be the support. And once again, I didn't let it slide. And people will say there's a time and place to have this conversation. The thing is, in mental health, never in my life did we ever tell anyone sharing a story of abuse that there was a right place to share that info. We always supported the message. Your time is when you are ready to share that experience. And so how come when it comes to sharing experiences of race, we have to pick and choose a right time to have that conversation? So what really makes me angry, it's not that part, not even the part of protecting this white friend's fragility. It's that when I freeze up, I'm like taking on the burden, the responsibility, the protection, all the hope of maybe we'll circle back to this one day and we'll fix this and, we won't have these problems. And really, I'm taking all that on. All the while, I have this like privilege where I can choose to stay silent. But I'm angry because I feel in these relationships, whether they're with coworkers, whether they're with great friends, family, it's like you feel taken advantage of because it's about making the white person feel better for your story and what it is that you want to share or not accept in the story that I'm sharing. And I struggle with that. And a wise woman of color told me that is not my burden to take on. And I'm passing it along to the rest of you that are doing this because she's right. Don't tell her I told her that, but she's right because when we protect people from their responsibility, we are enabling them and we are sort of building some kind of numbness for them to not experience what's actually happening in the moment. And I think that's not helpful. Okay, and in all of this, like what's really wild is we know all of this. None of this is a surprise. We know how whiteness operates. We see it, we experience it, we dissect it in all of our private conversations. But the moment we're confronted with it directly, we doubt ourselves, we stay quiet, we are frozen, we don't know what to do, we take the burden on because we've been conditioned to keep white comfort intact. And I don't want to do that anymore. The women who have been helping me figure out how I cannot do that anymore and how to have more experiences where I can share the load with the women of color who are so far ahead, who've been paving the way, who have been writing the books, having the conversations. Thank you for your patience for women like me who take a little while to get there. And I'd love to share some of the resources that have been helping me along the way. One of the things that really helped me when I first started the journey of like unpacking some of this internal racism and like as the white girl complex, as I have been calling it. I read a book by an author named Fatima Farheen Mirza. She wrote a book called A Place for Us. And it's so hard to find books for people of color that are just everyday experiences that we can relate to. Words used, names. This was a story about an immigrant family that came to US. The kids were born there. It was a family of 5. There was lots of things that I connected to with the siblings and the story of the siblings growing up with their own versions of being first generation kids. Amazing story. Taught me a lot. 2 people that have been really helping me recognize patterns and breaking them. One, I talk about this author all the time. I borrowed the Angry Brown Girl Club title for the series from her, Ruby Hamad. She has a book. white tears, brown scars. We talk about this all the time. There was so much conversation in this that lays out what white feminism is, where it came from, and how it comes up in our day-to-day. I also want to thank Ijoma Olu'u, who wrote So You Want to Talk About Race. She's a biracial woman who connected me to ways that my husband and I can support our mixed race kids, but also how white feminism also shows up when white moms are parenting their daughters of color. Another book that I found really helped me understand a lot of the trauma and the history from my own Sikh community. She is a Canadian author, Nav Gill, and I appreciate that this book was referred to me, Under the Moonlit Sky. This book talks about this woman from Canada, from BC, going to India, also one of those who would probably want to be called at the time a coconut, and sort of her journey out as she happened to be in Punjab in 1984. Really, really helpful. Then there's like women who have helped me understand language better. Language is not neutral. It's a tool of power. And while watching the Race to Dinner series, the Deconstructing Karen movie by Syra Rao and Regina Jackson, there was a moment in there that was really clarifying when Syra talks about how she woke up brown. And if you've been following previous podcasts, I talk a lot about my white girl complex. And I woke up one day recently and I realized I wasn't white. And when Syra talked about waking up brown, it sort of helped me realize that even when I share this journey, I'm still making the lack of being this white girl and up to these white standards. And that's like a bad thing that I'm not white. And so just changing that, just stopping from saying things like Oreos and coconuts, waking up brown, very, very powerful, and recognizing what that means and how to be brown as I'm figuring that out. Thank you to Syra for having the kind of conversations that she is choosing to have with white women at these dinners. And I really encourage you guys to check that out. And then most importantly are the women of color that are in my private group chats that I see, that I get to share these experiences with, that I can just like openly cry. My racialized therapist. These women are the everyday heroes that are not famous influencers, don't have these documentaries, don't have books, but are in the trenches every day at work, showing up and questioning why it is something was said in the way it was, that are going back and following up when people say the things they do to keep the baseline of the white norm. These women are my heroes, and I want to thank you so much. One more woman, and her podcast that I'll share as a tool for you is Anna Swan. She has the Bloodstained podcast. She does a compare and contrast of true crime and the slave trade. And I think if you want to know more about history and the untold parts of history, it's a great podcast to check out. I just want to say, like, one thing I'm learning is those of us that are just waking up brown, that are just realizing this internalized racism, we don't have to do it alone. There is a lot of support and patience. We just have to be brave and willing to put ourselves out there and do the work to, I think, recognize where some of this own self-inflicted harm has been coming from over the years and what's the thing to do about that. Because isn't that what the goal should be? Shouldn't we want to read these books, have these conversations, figure out what we're going to do with these things so that we can raise our kids to understand their privileges, to recognize them, not in shame, not in guilt, but like in awareness? And shouldn't we want them to use your privilege through dialogue, through real-time interactions, to make space for others, to share privilege instead of hoarding it? That's really what I want for the next generation. And I'd rather go there than being in this helpless place. And honestly, in order for us to go there, we have to start with ourselves. So let me leave you with this. Segment 5, the reference check. All right. You know, when you apply for a job and they ask for references, they don't ask you for the name of someone you had a 5-minute chat at a networking event with. No, they ask for people who know you really well, people who know how you handle conflict, people who know if you show up, people who know how you work under pressure. Now, apply that to allyship. If someone were to call you in for a reference, who would back you up? Not the person you took a DEI workshop with. Honestly, like I'm talking about the people who have actually seen you choose discomfort over silence, who have witnessed you risk something, friendships, reputation, job security, to stand against racism when it mattered. Would your name pass that reference check? And if you are in the mental health field, please ask yourselves, how are you truly preparing for the clients of color you serve? Just because one person of color tells you you are a fantastic therapist or fantastic mental health support or serve them well in the emergency room does not mean that you are the best at this. It means you did it one time. There was something great, but I've also been that person in the ER who was treated poorly and was like, thank you so much. You're fantastic. So I think the one person or the few people, that's not going to be enough here. Whatever field you are in, how are you truly doing the work? Does the company you work for have a DEI committee? Do you know why you need that committee? Who is running that committee? If you're a person of color, be curious about why you weren't asked your opinion about any of this. Are the people in your HR department majority white? Your board? Start here. Because if not, then what are you really doing? And if you're feeling defensive right now, that's good. That's how it starts. But stick with it. If your first instinct is to prove yourself, then let me help you. You don't get to decide. Your actions do. So sit with it. Examine it. Because for people of color, this discomfort is not a moment. It's not a conversation we can dip in and out of. It's our lives. So ask yourself, what will you do with this information? What will you do now?